Hello and welcome back, everybody, to another of our occasional hot topics. This one is on the back of Trump having been elected as the American president. Yes, probably quite a few of us woke up that Wednesday morning thinking, oh my God. We have invited a couple of regular guests of the podcast to have a chat with us, just to share our initial reactions. Really, it's not terribly structured, the conversation. We cover quite a lot of different ground. It's possibly more group therapy than political analysis, but if you're feeling that way too, then maybe you'll enjoy this. Maybe it'll make you feel better.
It's interesting you put it like that, actually, because it actually did make me feel better. I've been feeling completely depressed over that result. I mean, I was pretty depressed over our general election result when the way that all turned out, but this one, I had been optimistic that Kamala Harris would win, but anyway, that's completely wrong. It's not only has she not won, he's also got control of Congress, which is huge shift. Anyway, as Fiona said, it's not really structured enough to give you a contents list exactly, but we talked about things like, well, is Trump irrational? And the point got made, I think, by Bill that, just that someone can be trying to do good things and trying to do bad things, whether they're rational or not, is a kind of separate from that. What about Putin? Is Putin irrational? Putin's not irrational the way that Trump is, I think. So we had a chat about that. And then we got on to the United Kingdom's independent nuclear deterrent. Is it really independent? Really? That got us on to Trump and NATO. And as I remember, it was Isobel making quite a good point. Might NATO be better off without the United States in it? We were also touched on social media billionaires and political influence. It was a really good chat, and I'm not optimistic, but I'm kind of not quite as flat as I was. So hopefully other people will find that effect as well. Welcome everyone to another episode of Scottish Independence Podcast, and we're here today with Bill Ramsay and Isobel Lindsay. The pair of you are beginning to be a regular appearance on the podcast, and we always enjoy having you. So this time, just for the benefit of viewers and listeners, Isobel and Bill contacted us shortly after we knew the result of the American presidential race, and we knew that Trump therefore had got back in, and they contacted us and said, can we come on and can we talk about that result in the context of nuclear weapons, nuclear arms, the various conflicts that are going on around the world. So that's the general kind of context. I expect other things will come into it as we go on.
I often feel that I'm repeating the same thing over and over, but because the fantasy of UK independent question marks round deterrent is peddled so constantly and has been for so many years. And the reality of the US total control of that system has never really been revealed to the public. And I think this is an opportunity which we have to try and get this point across. That and particularly since some people, including one or two in the SNP in more senior positions, are saying, oh, this is a time when who is going to perform this nuclear role for NATO if the US withdraws further out of its NATO leadership dominant position. And this is why we've got to reveal the reality that the UK nuclear system is totally dependent on the United States and has been for decades. And that includes the ultimate control of who presses the trigger. And this fantasy continues and continues, and our media just go along with it without doing any astute analysis. Now, the reason why this is so, it goes back to the late 50s, and where we had a situation in which the UK, yes, it had nuclear warheads, but its delivery system, Blue Streak, etc., had failed. So it had to go cap in hand, first of all to Eisenhower, then to Kennedy, to plead for a delivery system, which, with conditions, that's why the condition was that we gave them the Holy Loch. But anyway, that started it. So the UK was dependent on the US for its delivery system. Now, when it comes to Trident, the situation there is, yes, the UK manufactures warheads to the US design, has to wait until that's finalised. It does build the submarines to the US design. And one reason for quite a lot of the delays, it's got to wait until the Americans have sorted out what the design has to be. But when it comes to the crucial delivery system, the missile, then that we're totally dependent on the US. And it's not a simple case of, oh yes, we lease it, that makes us dependent on them, but it's the failure to realise that the control mechanisms in those systems, the targeting, is something that almost certainly is held by the United States and has been for a long time. And the missiles go back to the US for servicing regularly. Now, if we go back, it was on the anniversary of Falklands that there was quite a lot of coverage of the fact that, yes, it was afterwards discovered that the Exocet missiles, this is 40 years ago, the Exocet missiles that France sold to Argentina had a stop-kill device in them, which the French still held control over. Obviously didn't tell the Argentinians that. So 40 years ago, that technology was there. Just think of the technological advances and just think of the fact that it would actually have been quite irresponsible for the US to lease its missiles to anybody, because after all, from their point of view, who knows who might come into power in the UK or what might happen. So it is Trump's finger, which is now on the Faslane nuclear fleet button. Mm-hmm. And we've got to get that across. And the fantasy that if the US retreats from NATO, or it wants to retreat substantially from European involvement, but nevertheless, they'll just leave the UK in control of its missiles, is what it is. It's a fantasy. Yeah. And it's just been perpetuated in order to maintain this phony big power part of the UN Security Council status.
Yeah. I knew bits of that. I mean, I certainly knew that we were dependent on the US, but I don't think I'd quite kind of taken on board the wholesale nature of that. But first of all, I'm thinking presumably France with its nuclear deterrence. I mean, presumably they are not dependent on the US. Is that right?
No, France does actually have an independent nuclear system. Britain does not. The irony.
Yes, it did. Yeah, the irony. I mean, I'm also thinking, in some ways, though, Trump's finger on the nuclear button is something we'll return to. But and the fact that it'll be America that picks the target. But is that not kind of what would be actually needed anyway, given that any kind of nuclear war is going to be decided in 15 minutes, and you can't actually phone up a British general and say, who would you like us to attack? I mean, in a way, it's got to be like that.
The way there are different decision-making levels in the use of a nuclear weapon, right? It depends who has control of the weapon at a particular time. Now, when they talk about tactical nuclear weapons, in one sense, there is no such thing. But if the person who has the finger on the button or the finger on the switch has got 1 star, a brigadier general on their collar. That's a tactical commander. Now, they're always strategic, supposedly policy overlaying that to stop a tactical commander making a decision that is off the rail. But there's a basic thing about warfare, and this is the case as long as human beings have fought in wars. Plans don't survive for very long because it's a conflict situation, and plans change, circumstances change, and people make mistakes. And people made mistakes at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. One particular commander of a destroyer was told not to use depth charges because there was Russian submarines in the vicinity. So for a laugh, he just threw hand grenades over the side.
For a laugh.
We'd say he couldn't make it up. It would make a good dramatic movie, But, that sort of thing. But the point about it is it's mistakes being made. Moreover, Isobel made a point about France's nuclear weapons being independent of the United States. That may well be true. But Netanyahu has got nuclear weapons as well. Now, how can one put this? The current Prime Minister Israel has got form that borders on, if not, and may well be genocide, right? Is he a stable actor in international relations field, to use that bland term?
Yeah.
I'm not so sure he is. But he's got his finger on a bomb, the way that Donald Trump has a finger on the bomb. And the two of them are politically quite closely aligned. Stephen Colbert, an American comic, he had his own television program. His production company produced some cartoons called Our Cartoon President. There it is. Well done. There we have the commander-in-chief of the world's military hegemon. And he will once again become the commander-in-chief of the world's military hegemon, right? And we never had a hegemonic military globally before. That's him. And in the system of command, when he gets off Air Force One or when he gets off the helicopter and he salutes the sergeant at the bottom of the steps, that's not political theatre. He is actually the commander-in-chief. And next to him there is in full dress uniform, because when these officers go to the White House, they've got to wear their full dress uniform, standing there with a case with the nuclear codes. You've got the officer, when Trump looks at him, the officer takes a step back, and he walks towards him, and the officer takes another step back, and then he runs at the officer, and the officer jumps over a couch with a case. Now, hold that thought in your mind. The nuclear forces of the United States are under, it's not Strategic Air Command, it's had a successor, I can't remember what the organisation's called at the moment, but it's a 4-star Air Force general. And at some point during Trump's presidency, and I can't find this clip, you've got a 4-star Air Force general explaining, as he would, of course, the relationship between the president and not the man with the case, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I'll come back to them later on, the senior military commanders of all the military services, where they have a set of targeting options for the president. So if the president is thinking of going nuclear, they will advise him on potential targeting options. And there's a short wee film made by a 4-star US general during Trump's presidency explaining how that works. Now, in one sense, you could say it's a wee training video. It's a sort of intellectual curio. But it was done during the time of Trump's first presidency. Some American outlets were suggesting that this is the Air Force trying to reassure the public that there are adults in the room. That may be the case, but Donald Trump is commander-in-chief. And when we consider that Barack Obama had negotiated a nuclear deal with Iran, in which Iran would change their civilian nuclear program and not continue to work towards the development of weapon-grade material.
Yeah, that's what they were doing, enriching uranium.
That's right. Yeah. So Obama had that deal in place. Trump comes to power and he trashes it. And if you look at the arms control architecture since the Cuban Missile Crisis, over the years, certain treaties were established on various bits of arms control. Reduce weapons in that area, reduce weapons in that area, do this, do that. And gradually, under Trump, these treaties have not been renewed. And in response, the Russians recently, they've not bothered about renewing them either. So the arms control architecture is now very threadbare compared to what it was before. Instead of working towards it, and we in the anti-nuclear movement have always said they never go far enough, but now they're going nowhere. It's just at a halt. I don't know what the diplomats who were involved in that got up to these days, but they're not meeting each other and they're not talking to each other to the same extent as they used to. And that is really important. And now, of course, you've got Iran and you've got Netanyahu goading the Americans into some sort of hot war with Iran. And that's where we are at the moment. Again, there are many things that are not talked about the current Palestinian Gaza situation, Lebanon situation. Again, the media's reporting is, shall we say, rather selective. And one of the things they're rather selective about is they simply don't mention that Israel has a bomb. So what happens if that becomes a target for someone? What does Israel do? Given the attitude of many in Israel, their attitude to politics, it's if you were to ask the public now, do you think Israel has a nuclear weapon? Most of the public wouldn't know. And if you ask the public, do you think Israel under Netanyahu should have nuclear weapons? They'd be horrified. But again, there isn't a discourse about that, and we need a discourse about that aspect as well. So the Trump presidency, in terms of nuclear issues, is really quite important. And the idea that Isobel was said of turning round, and the idea of the independent nuclear so-called deterrent is a lot of nonsense. To go on to Isobel's point about the nuclear weapons, the late John Ainsley told me this. So you have a Trident missile, that's a launch system, serial number 12345, and it's made in a factory, I think, in California. Then it goes to Kings Bay, an American Navy base in the Atlantic coast, and it goes into storage. And at some point, while it's sitting there, an Ohio-class American submarine will come in, offload their missiles, take on a new load of missiles, and head out, for a period of time. They go back to the base, the missile goes back into storage, gets reconditioned. Then a British Vanguard-class sub comes in, gets the same missile because Britain rents them. They go across to Coulport, and they get the warhead fitted. Now, at some point, the following almost certainly happened. America is a cyber leader in the world. I mean, various countries have claimed they are, but the Americans are. Of course they are. They've got more resources than anybody else. At some point, someone will have went into the American president, the head of the Navy or the chair of the Joint Chiefs, and told maybe Obama, maybe someone before it, but certainly by now, Mr. President, see these missiles that we rent the British? We can put a wee patch, an electronic patch in it, to make sure that you have final control of whether or not they will actually be operable. And here's the question. Do you want us to remove that patch? Do you want us to disable that patch? Now, I find it personally not credible an American president would want to take away that command and control facility from himself. But let's assume he did. That same briefing would go to the Armed Services Senate Committee, made up of Republicans, made up of Democrats, made up of senators of a hawkish nature and otherwise. Think about the MAGA base, Make America Great Again, which has just been proved to be spectacularly electorally successful, no matter what we'll say about it, and I don't like it, but it has. The MAGA point of view. A Republican turning around and saying, what, you're telling me that the president, who could keep control of these missiles we rent to Britain, has taken away our control? Nah, we're not having that. So for that reason, we can be 99, more or less confident that the United States is in control of the Trident missiles that Britain claims is independent. I mean, the idea of their independence for those reasons is a piece of nonsense.
So when you say, a patch in there that would take away control, Are you thinking, well, there's what you're thinking, and then there's a bit separately from that, Bill, there's what you've picked up about what the British armed forces are thinking. So are you thinking that patch just disables a missile, so it maybe gets fired off, but it flops into the sea?
Well,
or it actually takes control over where it's going?
No, I think it would probably flop into the sea, but the point is Britain would be incompetent if it didn't do the following. When the Trident missiles come to Coulport, they themselves would do a big cyber security sweep of it to see if there are any patches, to make sure they're functional. So I don't know the details of that, but it's a matter of a reportage and considering it. If the media are not going to consider it and it doesn't suit the narrative, they simply won't raise it. And if someone is sitting there, clothed literally in, someone of general or, admiral rank uniform and says A is B, then people will believe the A is B. But it's not just about that. We've got some slivers of evidence. We know that the Russians haven't, under patent, given you North Korea some Russian launchers. I'm not talking about the warheads, I'm talking about launchers. And these Russian launchers, I can't remember what ones, but they've been in service for maybe 3 decades. Not the launchers, they've not been given used launchers, but the system that the Koreans have. And when the Koreans have fired those, done their own test firing, they've had a relatively large number of failures compared to when the Russians did it. And in some journals and so on, folk have speculated, has the United States been able to tamper the missiles that go to the Koreans? And you can ask the same thing, of course, of the strategic forces of Russia. Do they give the missiles to the Koreans and have their own patch? The point is, it's an American missile, it's rented. If the Americans have the cyber ability to do it, they'll do it. They'll do it for a whole series of reasons, for command and control under their own strictures as well. After all, what happens if one of these boats gets damaged? They would want to disable them and things like that. So having it, even if America did not rent out their missiles to anybody else, they would want that facility if they could develop it.
Yeah. This, of course, is why the UK has had to bend the knee to the United States so often, because of this total dependence on the nuclear weapons side or nuclear delivery side. Because the British state has made being a nuclear power so central to its international identity, to its status, then anything that could possibly threaten it. Now, quite frankly, given the number of nuclear weapons and their delivery systems that the US has, having the UK with them as an ally in the nuclear context is really not important. It was quite useful way back at the beginning of the 60s when the range of their missiles wasn't as great, which is why they wanted the Holyloch base. That doesn't matter now. What is useful to them is that it gives them this commitment, this tie over the UK. So it knows it has an obedient ally there, and if that ally steps out of line, then it can say, right, I think we'll cancel that leasing. And this is how you have to understand the nature of the British state, and much that British state, like of course Iraq, etc., much of the decisions that have been taken over recent decades, and why Scotland really, really, really wants and needs to get out of it.
And why they'd be so reluctant to let us go as well, with all that situation.
Exactly.
Well, there is, yes, there is that. I mean, does America have nuclear weapons, more the shorter range ones? I mean, they used to have them stationed in various parts of Europe, didn't they?
That's right. And that's an important factor as well, because that's behind it. Again, I want to make this crystal clear at the beginning, if we're going to talk a little about Ukraine. I don't agree with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It's a breach of international law. It's immoral. I think it was unnecessary. And I have friends, I've got 2 good friends whose fathers were Ukrainian. I'm not invested, but at the same time, I am not a Putin apologist. Please understand that. However, when you mentioned the point about shorter range nuclear missiles, you've got to view things, not necessarily agree from the other side.
Yeah.
You've got to try and tease out the other side. And by teasing out, that doesn't clothe it in virtue. Okay? So what I'm about to say is not a rationale. I'm not saying this is virtuous. It's just the hard realities of international relations. The United States has developed a tactical range nuclear weapons, and they're talking about bringing some of these classes back to Europe. For instance, we've seen very little of it, but the United States used to have nuclear weapons based in Lakenheath, and now they're bringing nuclear weapons back to Lakenheath. Okay, so hold that thought in your head for a moment. Something else we've seen with the Ukraine war and with the war in the Middle East, and I'll call it the war with the Middle East, is the use of quite long range and quite fast missiles armed with conventional warheads.
Yeah.
We've seen that used by the Ukrainians, the Russians firing into Ukraine, and the Ukrainians, as far as they are allowed to, fire them back at the Russians. We've seen them used by the Israelis, and we've seen them used by the Iranians. So we're now in a stage where there's a new class of weapon, if I might put it, that's now seen as very important. And there's an irony here, because these the sector leaders, if I'll put it in relation to these long range, what I'll call conventional missiles, so one could put a nuclear warhead on them, have been Russia, China, Iran, and some other countries. I can't remember the other ones. Now, the reason the Russians started to develop this technology is because back in the days of the Soviet Union, they knew that in a tactical, under conventional systems, air forces and so on, they were stuffed. The only thing they could do is try and develop these long-range missiles. And it's suited for various reasons the Chinese to do the same, and also for Iran's been involved. Because think of the following, and I saw this seminar at least 15 years ago. It was a program run by a series of lectures run by the American Navy with Johns Hopkins University. And it had a senior retired military, I can't remember who was a general, an admiral, I think it was from the Philippines or somewhere like that. And he was given the following example. And he was talking about China and America. So the United States get into a tussle with China, and things escalate. And the United States, as they often do, gunboat diplomacy, it's now aircraft carrier diplomacy, they send an aircraft carrier to the South China Sea or somewhere like that. And to show their support, Britain sends one or two of our aircraft carriers to show solidarity. And you've got a British aircraft carrier and an American aircraft carrier. And you've got your long-range missiles. Who do you shoot at first? You want to put a warning shot across their bows. What one of those two ships do you sink? The American carrier or the British carrier? I mean,
assuming the British one's got out of port.
Now, consider the following. Britain, and this is true, under Biden, David Lammy and Keir Starmer went to Washington to lobby the United States to allow the Ukrainians to use longer range missiles to fire into Russia. The State Department, who are more hawkish than Department of Defense, wanted to do that. And it was Lloyd Austin, according, I think it was the Washington Post or the New York Times, I can't remember what one of the two, so it's not Ramsay making this up. Apparently it was reported that Lloyd Austin vetoed it. In other words, the Department of Defense vetoed a more hawkish move being proposed by the State Department and supported by the British Prime Minister and the British Foreign Secretary. So that would have been escalatory, and the State Department, even the DOD says, no, we're not going to we're not going to sanction Ukraine allowing these longer range missiles. Because one of the points about the situation of the Ukraine war, and you can see it, some analysts are saying Russia has changed its policy in nuclear weapons about their use. They're implying that they would use the nuclear weapons earlier, possibly at the tactical phase. And remember what I said about who makes the decisions and when mistakes can be made. Various people have come on and said the Russians are only bluffing. Okay, they'll say the Russians are only bluffing. Well, when it comes to international relations, we're not in the land of Lord of the Rings. If a senior diplomat or a senior general in one side says the Russians are only bluffing, that's not an elvish spell that goes into Putin's head and he's bluffing. We don't live in fantasy world. Just because someone in one side says you're bluffing, it's not a spell. It's just a wishful thought, and it's a piece of nonsense. And that's the problem, because it brings in instability, it brings in risk, it brings in the idea of making a mistake.
As I understand it, what's more likely to happen, or it's because they're on their way to it, is that Ukraine, they're obviously frustrated at not being allowed to target further into Russia, or at least to target certain things in Russia. But they're doing a pretty good job about targeting oil supplies, chemical works, ships in the Black Sea, and even over in the Caspian, and they're not being allowed to use some of those delivery systems, but they're actually on their way to developing their own, as I understand it, aren't they? They're no slouches when it comes to armament technology.
With what they have, the Ukrainians have done relatively well, but it's because you're dealing with you're dealing with effectively an inland lake, and naval assets in an inland lake, it's like shooting duck, fish in a barrel. But the other thing about the Ukrainians is, in the situation, and again, no disrespect to them, they're going to come to some sort of deal with Russia. Now, way back November of 2022, the Russians have invaded, which was, as I said, a piece of nonsense. But also, from a military point of view, it was very incompetent. It was very badly. It was very botched. I just can't believe that the Russian intelligence services didn't know that Ukrainians were much better prepared than they had been in the past. Because after all, please forgive me for using this analogy, imagine Scotland was independent. It would be natural if the remainder of the UK wanted to have some sort of intelligence operation operating their embassy in Edinburgh. That's the way things work.
If indeed they don't already.
Yeah. But the point is, the point is they can spy in plain sight because of the cultural similarities between Scotland and England. They could spy in plain sight. The same goes for Ukraine. Yeah. The Russians would have been able to spy in plain sight. Putin must have simply ignored the information he was getting and literally just marched in with what they call administrative order. That is, vehicles one behind the other up a road. And the rest is history. But the point is, by November, the Ukrainians had pushed the Russians back. They'd recaptured Kharkiv. And at that point, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, in other words, not the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which is the president, but the uniformed commander just below the president, the chair of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, he gave a speech to, let's see, the organization he gave the speech to. It was the Economic Club of New York, and it was the 9th of November 2022. And he caused a shit show in the diplomatic circles because he turned around and said the following. I was looking for the quote, but we're online, so I don't have time to find it there. He said the following: the Ukrainians have achieved a hell of a lot. They've pushed the Russians back. The Russians are on the back foot, and this is what he said: now is the time to negotiate, because it won't always stay like this. And again, the rest is history. He said the Ukrainians should have negotiated then. And it is a fact that Turkey, NATO ally, were brokering talks between the Russians and Ukrainians. And then Boris Johnson went and told Zelensky, don't bother, we'll have your back. Well, we know that's not actually the case. Yeah. Despite what President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer said today, they said that they will have Ukrainians back. Well, they won't. If Trump changes his position, then they simply won't. And because of the sheer number of casualties, and the Ukrainians have fought very bravely, very professionally, massive numbers of Ukrainians have died and have been wounded, and masses of Russians have been died and wounded. And this grind is just going to continue. And at some point, it's accepted. I mean, if the Washington Post and the New York Times are writing articles about it, although the BBC doesn't report it, but if the New York Times and the Washington Post are writing articles about what the negotiated settlement is going to be like, it's going to end, and it'll end probably with
the tragedy in all of this. We go back to the situation where you have the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Now, I'm taking this from George Robertson, the former UK Defence Secretary, the former Secretary General of NATO, in an interview he gave to Times Radio. The opportunity was there and progress was being made for rethinking European security, having a broadly based, moving away from this division. NATO was set up as an anti-Soviet military alliance. And instead of trying to see how do we then develop new European-wide security structures, and there were various activities. There was a NATO-Russian Council set up. But according to Robertson, he said these things were all proceeding, and there was quite a lot of people in the organisation wanted to see it go much further. But then the US vetoed it and said, no, this is not the route we want to go down. And after that, in 2008, I think, NATO said, yes, it would eventually recognise Ukraine and Georgia as members of NATO. And then what we have had, we have had new missile bases in Poland, in Romania, right on Russian borders. What do you think the perception of this is on the other side?
Yeah.
So you have the Russians, and certainly Putin, feeling rejected and more paranoid. But you can see how that opportunity, the coming out of the Helsinki process and the continuing one, that where we could have done so much more, and it was stopped. And you had the US calling the shots, and you had the British government going along with it.
Yeah.
And that is how we have ended up. And I am shocked. I just heard one of them on last night. I can't remember which of the, liberal politicians. And just talking about how we're going to help Ukraine to keep on fighting, to pour in more weapons, when everyone knows who's got any kind of sense in this situation, it's just going to be more and more and more killing. None of them, including people like the SNP's Stephen Gethin, none of them are saying, how do we get some genuine negotiated peace here? Because somehow or other we're going to have to get there. And they're not thinking about it, they're not talking about it. And all I can say, if anything remotely positive might come from the Trump presidency, is that perhaps if the United States does decide to reduce its global role and try and keep its own society in order as they see it, although some of their idea of putting in order we might find deplorable. But if that happened, then I don't think that would be bad for the world, and I think it would certainly be good for Europe.
Yeah, it's interesting. You often hear, look, if we negotiate a peace between Ukraine and Russia, whereby Russia keeps, the Donbass and it keeps Crimea and that other bit that it's swept through, okay, that'll solve things in the short term, but all it has signaled to Putin, as long as he remains, in charge, is that he can get away with stuff. And, and then you've got, then you've got Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all kind of going, don't leave us exposed like this.
We say perhaps, first of all, rather specifically about Crimea and Donbass. When big empires collapse, Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, we saw the same. Sometimes the dividing line in terms of what emerge as states doesn't always fall in the right places. And Crimea, I think, definitely should have been part of Russia in that settlement. It only became part of Ukraine administratively in the old Soviet Union in the 1950s. And one of the interesting things, it was Craig Murray who did this, and I'd never seen it before, but the Soviet Union, and also that continued with Ukraine, when they did a census, they also asked the question about ethnic identity. Who do you identify with ethnically? And it was interesting, the majority in Crimea, I think it was something like 55%, identified as ethnic Russians. Only 25% identified as ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea. Now, in the Donbass area, and there were substantial minorities, but there were always minorities, like 30%, 40% in various cases, identifying as ethnic Russian. But there was a mess there and a real problem. And when there was the coup in 2014, and it was a coup, yes, there was loads of corruption, but there had been, I don't think it applies to Zelensky, but certainly the history previously from 1990 in Ukraine of corrupt governments was very, very common and recognized. But nevertheless, it was an invasion in Kyiv of the presidential palace that shoved out the existing elected prime minister. Now, that prime minister was unpopular in Kyiv, Western Ukraine, but he did have a base in Eastern Ukraine. And one of the first things the new government did was to declare that Russian would no longer be an official language. When you had large sections of the populations, particularly in the East. And that gave the opportunity, there were genuine rebels resisting all this, but it gave Russia the opportunity to feed them with weapons, encourage them, and that conflict was going on, but that conflict had some roots that weren't tackled.
Yes, I mean, I can understand. I mean, it's a good point, to make that, when empires like the Russian Empire was really Soviet Union collapsed, sometimes the borders don't get drawn in the correct places. But when you think about Ukraine, it's just so complicated, isn't it? I mean, Crimea, Stalin pretty well, exiled most of the ethnic Crimeans, Tatars. Well, I mean, he did the same with Crimea, with Ukrainians themselves. They kind of got exiled, and then of course he pretty well starved them as well. So it's so complicated about long-term. Well, there's people alive now in Ukraine who can remember that, or at least they remember their parents talking about it, and then from the other side, because fair enough, look at it from the Russian side. It was a big. I mean, it goes back to Catherine the Great, doesn't it? Who acquired, Crimea. So for them, it's also a bit of a humiliation and a loss not to have that. But that's just where this kind of thing historically is so difficult to kind of find a pathway.
Indeed. And I think the points about the Baltic states are interesting. I do think the Ukrainians will have some sort of, they'll have to come to some sort of deal with the Russians. God help any country that has its border in Russia or Israel. I mean, it's just hell. But the point is, to get back to the point about the other Baltic states, I perfectly understand why they're nervous. After all, they were part of the Tsarist Empire. I mean, people don't know that up until August 1914, one of the main cities of the Russian Empire for the Russian nobility was Warsaw.
Yeah.
The Russian Empire was very large at certain times. But the point is that, will the Russians, or are likely the Russians, to try and expand further eastwards? You'll not hear any discussion about the debate either way. And in my view, and in view of many others, that's a fairly incredible thing to happen. Because the Russian Federation is not Imperial Russia, though no doubt Vladimir Putin would like to be, nor is it the Soviet Union in terms of its scale, though no doubt Vladimir Putin would like it to be. It isn't. And we as British citizens who are trying to break away from Britain have a fairly granular knowledge of British imperial delusion. We're having to discuss about Russian imperial delusion. But the idea that they could actually, the Russian armed forces have the wherewithal, and I don't just mean now, in the future, to do that is seen as incredible. Indeed, one of the senior current serving generals in the British Army recently opined, because he was a professional and therefore can't say something ridiculous, completely ridiculous. He says, yes, Russia in about 10 or 12 years' time may well set their eyes on the Baltic states. But that's what he said, because he knows the idea that for at least a decade, the idea of the Russians going anywhere is absurd. But let's even assume that Putin, that there wasn't a deal, and for some reason Putin was to occupy Kiev. I mean, they don't have the wherewithal, and nor would they want to. I mean, I'm reminded of a DOD report that was done in the 1950s, the Department of Defense. So the president, I think it was Truman or somebody like that, was asked, could we go to war with China and beat them? And the answer was yes at the time. And then there was an addendum to the report. However, having beaten China, would then have to occupy it. And to do that, we'd have to increase the size of the army to 15 million men. In other words, the American army, which was somewhere about 1 million and 1.5 million, would have to increase after victory to 15 million just to hold China. So the idea of Putin being tied down in fighting an insurgency, which he would be facing in Western Ukraine, is simply not credible. It's not just a matter of fighting a battle, winning a battle. You then got to look at the peace.
Yeah.
That's what did for the Romans, wasn't it? You want to go back that far?
and I mean, when you, especially now, if you look at, I mean, Russia at the moment, I mean, they've lost something like, it's getting up to about 700,000 men from their army, and they've lost, they're bringing in tanks that have been sitting out in tank graveyards for decades, because big tanks are being destroyed by little first-person view drones.
But that's actually the case on both sides in that regard. I mean, I don't know what the figures are, because I don't trust either what the Russians say, because they're going to lie, as they should, because they're fighting a war, or what the Ukrainians are saying about their casualties, as they should, because they're fighting a war. Shooting bullets is part of war. Telling lies is part of war. It's not a virtuous Hollywood movie. Both sides will lie about the casualties, so we don't know. But one day I actually sat down, not quite back in the fag packet calculation. So I took 1916 and I took the Western Front, and we know the figures from the deaths in the Western Front, which was a pretty horrendous place. 1916 wasn't the worst year, but it was pretty bad. And some of the figures are talking about, casualty rates that would mean that the Russian army has lost something like, as you said, some figures, 700,000 men. That means that those who go into the front line, their chances of dying is 3 times as high as someone in the Western Front in either the German or the Allied armies in 1916. Likewise, when the Russians turn around and give hyperbolic figures for the Ukrainians, the casualty rates would be worse than in the Western Front. Now, if the casualty rates were anywhere near that, Ukrainian society would have collapsed long ago. So we know that they're losing they've lost tens of thousands of men and possibly hundreds of thousands of wounded men with disabling wounds. And we know the Russians have got something similar. And it's very, very large. But the figures, I don't trust the figures from either side.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I mean, fair, kind of fair enough there. I mean, you know, what the Ukrainians say is that their figures are accurate because they only count bodies that their drones actually pick up across the various fightings. But you know, that would be a hell of a difficult thing to do, considering that it's over 1,000. It's over 1,000 a day. Although I noticed that our defence spokesman the other day was saying that in the last month it's averaged 1,500 a day for the Russians. Of course, there's some there for Ukraine as well. Can we go back to this whole point about Trump? And I mean, is Trump an irrational actor?
I think so. I do think it. I mean, the man is. It's just weird. Well, it's weird. It's Trump. He comes out with lies. We know that. Mm-hmm. Americans have voted for him in very large numbers. We know that. He's now got what's called a supermajority in the political system. These are facts. He lies. There's been an election, and he's got a supermajority. Now, we're talking about irrational actors, but the question is, are the voters irrational? What is it about Americans, pardon me, and the fact they're voting for Trump? Kamala Harris got less women's votes than did Joe Biden 4 years ago. Kamala Harris, during the last time there was a primary election in the Democratic Party in 2020, at times, Kamala Harris, in opinion polls among Democratic voters who are going to vote in the primaries, was getting less than 1%. So I think from that, we can say safely with some facts that they're the facts, there's something behind that, and the question is, what is it that's behind it? And that, in one sense, is fascinating.
Personally, I think Trump is irrational, but what happened, what the American voters are doing isn't necessarily irrational from their point of view. I get, kind of weekly and emails through from Robert Reich, who, was a Secretary of State, or at least
very good as Robert Reich.
For the Kennedy. He's very, very good. And he sent one out just the other day with an analysis of that. And it's basically blue-collar workers in the States, anger at what's happened to their prospects, their kids' prospects, their wages, where it's all gone. And then I go, well, I can understand that, but why have they voted? But then why have they voted for the man who made it worse last time and isn't going to do any better this time? So
it's not just, of course, there. Of course, we've seen this in Europe. We've seen it up till now, primarily in England. One can only hope it doesn't seep in, although it may be starting to north of the border. And I think you have a lot of people who are angry, but they're also disoriented about what's the way forward. Is there hope? All kinds of terrible things seem to be happening. They don't feel security about the future, and they don't see answers. Kamala Harris was a machine politician. She was perfectly intelligent, she was perfectly competent, probably quite reasonable in a lot of her attitudes. She was a machine politician who would have never have done anything to really upset establishments. And this is the trouble. We've got the same in the UK with Starmer. And the problem that the SNP has got to watch is that what has emerged in recent years is a situation in which the Scottish Government won't stand up to establishments either. The Scottish Government won't challenge big landowners. They won't radically reform local democracy. They have been frightened to take on the big issues. Yeah, and they themselves have become managers. Big reforms that are needed. That's the lesson we had better learn, and we had better find people who have the vision and the courage to take on the big vested interests.
I mean,
huge theme, and exactly what you just said, Isobel, that came out of the conference, the Revival one yesterday. There was a lot about land reform and the opportunity, the open goal that's sitting there for the Scottish government to do something, bold and make a real difference that would get so much galvanized behind them, and we're sitting there waiting for them to act.
But also I think there's another whole area that we haven't covered yet, and we kind of do it now, but maybe we could come back and do this again, which is the role of well, I was going to say social media and algorithms, but it's gone. I think that affected the Brexit campaign, with Cambridge Analytica kind of stuff. But it's also, I was reading, there's an article that Carol Cadwallader has got in the Guardian just the other day, and her thesis is it's now gone further. It's not just the social media itself, it's the folk who are in charge of the social media. So not just the social media platforms, but the billionaires who run them.
Let's consider the uptick in young men voting for Trump. Let's consider the uptick in young people voting for the political right in Europe. And let's consider the role of Reform UK in 2026. But let's assume in 2026, Reform UK and the Conservatives don't merge and they put candidates up against each other. The first reaction is they'll split their vote and they'll get nothing in the list. But here's a wee scenario. Reform UK pretend that they're separate from the Conservatives, and they decide to look at free ports, and they go on an anti-immigration line. They go on the fact that it's a fact they're less regulated, and they put up scenarios for the operations and things that could go on in a free port area. And they punt that, and that becomes part of the discourse. So in the one, it's like a pincer movement. You have the Conservatives in one hand, and you have Reform UK trying to appeal to disaffected working class voters in Scotland. Imagine the effect that could have on the list.
It's very difficult to have any optimistic scenario ahead of us in international affairs. But the one thing you can say is that Scotland, with independence, would be in a very, very special situation in being a country which could say we are reversing the drive towards more and more nuclear weapons. And we are moving in the different direction. We are going to try to lead opinion away from the spiraling militarism that is so dominating the world. There's a great opportunity there.
Isn't there? That's a lovely thought to finish on, actually. Yeah.
Well, let's hope that we, at some point, get the chance to do that.
So that was our chat with Isobel and Bill. And I certainly, like Marlene, I felt better having had the chat. Not 100% reassured about the future, but better. So let us know actually in the comments how you're feeling about it as well. We talked at the end about social media and that kind of thing, realized it was far too big a subject for us to tackle on the end of this other subject. So we will come back to that on a future program. So if anybody's got any thoughts on that, put that in the comments as well. So that's it for this hot topic, and we'll be back with our normal schedule.
And anyway, something will happen. Something always does.
Yes, so, that's true.
Thanks. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.
See you next time.
Bye now.